The night was long, and the wind carried a voice older than history itself, a voice that whispered through the cracks of 1,000 homes, a voice that tested the limits of what it meant to be human. In the heart of medieval Europe, winter was not a season. It was an adversary, merciless, unrelenting, and patient. Each night, as frost crept over the fields and the stars sharpened in the black sky, ordinary men and women faced a question older than any king or creed. How do we survive until morning? The peasants of the Middle Ages were the invisible pillars of their world. No grand banners bore their names, no chronicles sang of their courage, yet without their hands, the kingdoms above them would have crumbled into dust. They worked the earth that refused to love them, tilling frozen soil that cracked beneath their wooden plows. When the first snow fell, it marked not beauty, but battle. Every flake meant less warmth, less food, less chance. Imagine it now, a small hut crouched in the dark countryside, its walls a patchwork of mud, straw, and prayer. Inside, a family huddles around a single ember, the faint heartbeat of fire fighting to keep them alive. Smoke curls through the air, biting their throats, but they welcome it. It keeps the fleas and ghosts at bay. Outside, wolves howl across the frozen fields, their cries weaving with the wailing wind, and the moon watches in silence, indifferent to the suffering below. They wore everything they owned. Layers of wool rough as bark, cloaks stiff with dirt and sweat, rags wrapped around their feet like desperate bandages. To wash was to invite death, for the chill that followed could claim you before dawn. So they wore their grime like armor, a living crust of survival. At night they lay on beds of straw that whispered with every breath. Children curled against their mothers, grandparents pressed close to the hearth, and sometimes even the livestock joined them. Cows, goats, chickens, all breathing, all shivering, all part of one fragile warmth held together by faith and instinct. If you were lucky, you awoke with your toes still yours. If not, the morning frost would claim them, one by one, a silent toll for another night endured. And yet, amid the smoke and filth and frozen air, there was laughter. There was song. The peasants told stories of saints and devils, of brave fools who tricked winter with cleverness and wine. They prayed not for riches or glory, but for the smallest miracles: a dry roof, a good harvest, a warm child's breath. And perhaps that is the truest measure of civilization, not in the crowns of kings, but in the quiet endurance of those who refused to surrender to the cold, because survival itself was a form of rebellion. Each spark struck against the darkness carried the same defiance, that would one day ignite revolutions and rewrite empires. In every generation, humanity meets its own kind of winter, and every time we find a way to keep the fire alive. The centuries turned. The huts of mud became halls of stone. The peasants' prayers gave way to politics, ambition, and desire. And somewhere in the echo of a royal court, a different kind of frost began to form, not of ice, but of intrigue. The year was around 1520. England stood proud beneath the rule of a king whose hunger for legacy burned brighter than any hearth. His name was Henry VIII, and in his shadow moved a woman whose story would shake the foundations of church and crown alike, Anne Boleyn. She was not born to command history, but destiny has a habit of finding those who least expect it. Anne entered the world not in a palace but in the modest halls of the Boleyn family. Noble, yes, but far from royal. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a diplomat, ambitious, clever, a man who knew that power in Tudor England flowed not only through blood, but through charm, wit, and opportunity. Anne learned early how to read a room before she could read a book. When she was still a girl, she was sent across the sea to the shining courts of Europe, first to the Netherlands, then to France. There, she absorbed the elegance of diplomacy, the art of conversation, and the subtler language of influence. While others learned to bow, Anne learned to command attention. She watched queens who ruled through intellect and presence, women who turned whispers into power. She was not the fairest of England's flowers, but there was something about her, a spark that drew the eye and refused to release it. When she returned to England, the court of King Henry VIII was alive with pomp, pleasure, and politics. She entered as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, graceful, sharp-tongued, a foreign-trained woman with fire behind her eyes. And soon the king noticed Henry VIII was a man who had everything, except the one thing he desired most, a son, an heir to carry his name into eternity. When he saw Anne Boleyn, he saw more than beauty. He saw a possibility, a new beginning. He wrote letters, poems, and promises, each one dripping with obsession. But Anne was no ordinary courtier. She refused the easy path. She would not be his mistress, would not surrender herself to a role that history would forget by the next sunrise. If Henry wanted her, he would have to crown her, and so began a love affair that would fracture the world. The king, once the Church's most loyal son, challenged Rome itself for her hand. For 7 years, England trembled in the storm of their union. Councillors whispered, bishops quarrelled, and across Europe, kings and popes held their breath, all for one woman who dared to say no. When at last Henry broke with Rome, founding the Church of England, he placed a crown upon Anne's head and made her queen of a divided realm. But as the bells rang through London, the sound carried not just triumph, but an omen. In the grand halls of Westminster, Anne Boleyn shone like a torch, and like all torches, she drew both light and shadow. She was intelligent, opinionated, and unafraid to challenge even the king. For a time Henry adored her defiance. But power changes all men, and when the crown grew heavy on her head, the world that had lifted her began to pull her down. Her first child, Elizabeth, was a girl, a disappointment to a man who measured legacy in sons. 2 miscarriages followed, each one carving invisible cracks through their marriage. And at court enemies circled. Whispers became rumours, rumours became charges. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, now turned the machinery of the state against her. Adultery, treason, incest, lies, all of them, but lies are often sharper than truth. In May 1536, Anne was taken to the Tower of London. The same walls that had once echoed with the laughter of kings now heard her footsteps, measured, steady, unafraid. Witnesses say she prayed, not for her life, but for the safety of her daughter. And when the blade finally fell, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. A single stroke ended her life, but not her story, because from her bloodline would rise a queen, Elizabeth I, the woman who would lead England into its golden age. Anne's fire did not die. It was passed forward, an inheritance of courage, wit, and will, from peasants who survived the cold to queens who faced the axe. Humanity's story was the same, to endure, to rise again, to carve meaning from the cruelty of time. And even as England's towers glittered in the late Tudor sun, across the ocean another kind of storm was gathering. The world was shifting once more, and the echo of rebellion was about to awaken in a faraway harbour. A harbour filled not with crowns, but with crates of tea. The endurance of humanity, from the fall of a queen to the birth of a revolution, the world turns. Kingdoms rise, queens fall, and yet one thing endures, the restless will of humanity to be free. When Anne Boleyn's lifeless body was carried from the scaffold, her blood seeped into the stones of London Tower, stones that had already tasted the ambitions of kings and the fears of the forgotten. But the story of power and defiance did not end there. A century and more later, that same hunger for self-determination would cross the ocean, carried not by nobles or monarchs, but by ordinary men and women who believed that the right to live free was worth any cost. The scene shifts westward across the grey Atlantic. The year is 1770 and beyond. The British Empire has stretched its red-stitched fingers across the globe. To London, the colonies in America are distant children, profitable, obedient, and expected to stay that way. But the children have begun to think for themselves. For decades, Britain has taxed and legislated from afar, draining pennies from every printed sheet, every imported good, every cup poured in a tavern. At first the colonists grumbled. Then they argued. Then they acted. The air in the streets of Boston grows heavy, thick with suspicion and gunpowder. Sailors and farmers rub shoulders in smoky taverns, their voices low, but their hearts loud. They speak of rights, of representation, of a parliament that sees them as subjects, but not citizens. They call it taxation without representation. But beneath the politics burns something older, the same instinct that kept the medieval peasant alive in the cold and drove Anne Boleyn to defy a king, the refusal to bow. In 1773, Britain makes a fatal mistake. It offers the colonies a bargain, cheap tea from the East India Company. But the colonists see the trap. Accept the tea and they accept the tax. Accept the tax and they surrender the principle. And so, on a frigid December night, Boston stands on the edge of history. Snow dusts the rooftops. The harbour is black and still. In the taverns, candles gutter in the draught as men whisper of action. Among them, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, names that will soon thunder through centuries. Thousands gather in the Old South Meeting House. The air hums with tension, breath turning to mist. When word arrives that the royal governor will not allow the ships to leave without unloading their cargo, Samuel Adams stands and says, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." A hush falls. Then, from outside, a single cry, a wild, fierce whoop echoing off the icy bricks. The signal. Through the dark streets, men move swiftly, wrapped in blankets, faces smeared with soot. They are not thieves, not rioters, but rebels. They make for Griffin's Wharf, where 3 ships wait, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Each ship heavy with tea and with symbolism. They climb aboard with purpose, their axes flashing in lantern light. Crates split open, spilling fragrant leaves into the night air, an aroma both sweet and defiant. One by one, 342 chests are heaved overboard. The water churns dark as ink, swallowing the Empire's pride. Not a coin stolen, not a sailor harmed. Only the tea, the symbol of obedience, destroyed. When dawn rises, Boston Harbor looks like a vast brewing cauldron, the sea turned black with defiance. And somewhere in London an empire begins to tremble. King George III reads the reports with mounting rage. To him this is not protest, it is treason. Parliament responds with fury, hammering down the intolerable acts. They close Boston's port. They strip Massachusetts of self-rule. They send red-coated soldiers to live among the very people they mean to control. But punishment breeds unity. From New York to Virginia, wagons roll north carrying food and hope to the starving city. Letters are written by candlelight. Speeches echo through meeting halls. A nation begins to awaken, not yet called America, but already thinking as one. In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies gather in Philadelphia. They come as strangers, they leave as brothers. For the first time, they speak with a single voice. They are not pleading anymore. They are preparing. By the spring of 1775, the tension snaps. On the green fields of Lexington and Concord, the crack of musket fire splits the morning. The British march to seize colonial weapons, but instead they ignite a revolution. No one knows who fired the first shot. History calls it the shot heard round the world. And indeed it was, because that sound, a single defiant burst, would echo across continents and centuries. It was the sound of ordinary people deciding that enough was enough. The same echo had once risen from the throats of peasants in the cold, from a queen defying a king, and now from farmers facing the might of an empire. The names change, the weapons change, but the will, the will to stand, is eternal. The American Revolution was more than a war of independence. It was proof that humanity, when pressed against the wall, will always push back. The tea that sank in Boston Harbor became the ink with which liberty wrote its first words. The world would never be the same again. Yet even as muskets roared and flags unfurled in the New World, across another ocean, beyond deserts and time itself, another story lay buried. A story older than kings, older than empires, older even than the written word. Long before London, before Rome, before Egypt raised her pyramids, there was a city that breathed in silence beneath the Peruvian sun. A city built not on conquest, but on harmony. A civilization that rose from the dust and was forgotten for 5,000 years. The lost city beneath the sands, Caral, before the sound of muskets at Concord, before Anne Boleyn's crown gleamed beneath Tudor torches, before the peasants of medieval Europe huddled against their frozen walls, the first breath of civilization stirred, not in Egypt, not in Mesopotamia, but in a barren valley by the Pacific coast of what we now call Peru. 5,000 years ago, the Soup Valley was a place of extremes, a land where the sun burned without mercy by day, and the cold winds whispered across the desert by night. The river that wound through its heart was thin, almost fragile, a silver thread of life against an ocean of dust. And yet here, humanity dared to build something eternal. Rising from the sand, the city of Caral took form, a vast planned settlement of stone and earth, a masterpiece of geometry and will. Its plazas were circular, its staircases broad, its pyramids massive and solemn beneath the blazing sun, and all of it was built by people who had never seen a wheel, who had no written words, no metal tools, only hands, vision, and an unbreakable sense of purpose. Walk among those ruins now, and you feel it, the breath of something ancient, orderly, and astonishingly human. Stones laid 5 millennia ago still hold their place, bound by layers of earth and reed. They whisper of songs, of rituals, of lives once lived in harmony with the world. Unlike the empires that would follow, Caral was not born of conquest. No weapons have been found among its stones. No walls were built to keep enemies out. This was a civilization that chose creation over destruction, a society that grew not through war, but through wisdom. Their power was knowledge. They learned to coax life from the desert, channeling the river's fickle waters into fields of beans, cotton, and squash. Cotton became their treasure, spun into fine thread and woven into nets that fed them with the bounty of the sea. In return, they traded their harvest with distant villages, building a network of exchange that stretched along the Peruvian coast. And through that trade came something even greater than wealth: connection. Shells from the Pacific, stones from the Andes, and colors from tropical valleys found their way to Caral's plazas. Each carried not only material value, but stories, proof that humanity, even then, sought communion across distance. At the heart of Caral stood the Pyramid Mare, the Great Pyramid, 450 feet across, rising nearly 60 feet high. It wasn't a tomb. It wasn't a fortress. It was a stage for ritual, a place where people gathered under the stars to honor the forces that governed their fragile world. Fires once burned atop its terraces. Drums and flutes echoed through the night. And when the wind blew across the desert, it carried not fear, but music. Archaeologists uncovered flutes carved from condor bones, drums stretched with the hides of deer, instruments tuned to harmonize with the sound of the valley itself. In Caral, music was not entertainment. It was communication, a language between earth and sky. When we speak of civilization, we often speak of weapons, kings, and wars. But Caral speaks of something different, a world that measured greatness not in conquest, but in cooperation. Its leaders were likely priests and planners, guiding by knowledge, not fear. Their cities aligned with the stars, their festivals with the turning of the seasons, and even here, among the stones of peace, You can still feel the heartbeat of struggle, not the struggle against enemies but against the earth itself. To live in a desert is to bargain with time. And for centuries the people of Caral managed to keep that bargain, until at last nature changed the rules. Somewhere around 1800 BCE, the rains failed. The river shrank to a whisper, the fields dried, and the music that had once risen from the plazas fell silent. One by one, families drifted away. No invaders came. No flames consumed the city. It was abandoned not in violence, but in sorrow. The desert swallowed their footprints, the wind buried their temples beneath the sand, and the memory of Caral faded from human knowing. For 4,000 years it slept, its pyramids mistaken for hills, its plazas for mirages. And then one day, a woman listened to the silence. In the late 20th century, archaeologist Ruth Shady Solis began to dig into the earth of the Super Valley, following her intuition, a quiet certainty that these mounds of stone held secrets the world had forgotten. What she uncovered stunned history itself. Caral was older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than Stonehenge, older than every known city in the Americas. It was not a colony or an offshoot of another empire. It was the source, a cradle of civilization born from the minds and hands of a people who looked at a desert and saw possibility. Caral rewrote everything we thought we knew about human beginnings. It proved that progress does not belong to one continent or one people. Across the world, in many places, humanity rose from the dust at once, driven by the same desire to build, to belong, to endure. Today, as the sun sets over the ancient stones, the wind moves softly through the empty plazas. You can almost hear it, a faint echo of flutes, a murmur of voices, the ghost of a song that once held an entire civilization together. Caral stands as a mirror to us all, reminding us that our greatest strength has never been domination, but cooperation. That even in the harshest landscapes, the human spirit finds ways to grow gardens from dust. The same spark that lit fires in the peasants' hearths, that burned in Anne Boleyn's eyes, that blazed across Boston Harbor, it burned here first, in the hands that placed these stones, in the minds that turned silence into song, in the hearts that chose peace over war. And as we gaze upon these ruins, we are not looking into the past. We are looking at ourselves, at what we were, what we are, and what we might yet become, because history is not a line. It is a circle, a great unending breath that moves through time, shaping and reshaping what it means to be human. The legacy of endurance, the story of humankind, is not written in ink or carved in stone. It is written in breath, in the steam of a peasant's sigh on a winter morning, in the prayer of a queen before the blade, in the shouted defiance of a rebel beside a midnight sea, and in the silence of an ancient city half buried beneath the sand. Across 5,000 years, the same heartbeat endures. Empires rise, faiths divide, oceans are crossed and conquered, yet always, at the center of it all, the fragile, miraculous thing called hope refuses to die. The spark every civilization begins with a single act of courage, the decision to believe that tomorrow can exist. For the peasants of medieval Europe, that courage took the shape of fire, a trembling flame that kept the cold from taking their children. For Anne Boleyn, it was a refusal to kneel, a belief that her voice, a woman's voice, could alter the fate of kings. For the patriots of Boston, it was the courage to say no to an empire that believed itself unshakable. And for the people of Caral, it was the faith that peace itself could be the foundation of greatness. The spark is the same. It burns in different ages, in different tongues, but it is always there, an ember that waits for breath. Cycles of darkness. Human history has never moved in straight lines. It turns endlessly like the seasons. After the harvests come the winters. After triumph, the fall. The peasants knew this in their bones, that every dawn was borrowed, that warmth demanded sacrifice. Anne learned it beneath the jeweled ceilings of power, as love turned to suspicion and promise to peril. The patriots of Boston tasted it in the smoke of their burning tea, knowing that rebellion would invite ruin before it brought freedom. And Caral? Caral fell to silence, not through war, but through the slow, inevitable change of the earth itself. Darkness is patient. It waits at the edge of every age, testing whether humanity will still choose the light. And time after time we do. The thread that binds from mud-brick huts to marble palaces, from flint to fire to steel and circuit, there runs a single thread, the will to connect. Peasants shared their warmth. Anne shared her vision. The revolutionaries shared their dream. Caral shared its peace. It is connection that saves us, the joining of hands across fear, the recognition that our survival is never solitary. Even now, when our cities blaze brighter than the stars, we carry that same instinct, to gather around the fire, to tell stories, to remind ourselves who we are. Echoes through time, listen closely. You can still hear them. The creak of wooden doors in a medieval village, the hush of silk in a Tudor hall, the splash of tea into a frozen harbour, the sigh of wind over Caral's pyramids. Each sound is an echo, a fragment of the long conversation between humanity and time. We speak through generations, sometimes in words, sometimes in deeds. Every act of kindness, every injustice, every discovery becomes part of that conversation. The stones remember, the oceans remember, and perhaps the stars remember too. The lesson of fragility: for all our brilliance, we remain fragile. One drought ended Caral, one whisper ended Anne. One winter could end a village. One tax, one spark could ignite a war. Civilization is not a fortress. It is a fragile promise, renewed each day by our choices. Every time we share instead of hoard, listen instead of silence, forgive instead of destroy, we rebuild that promise, brick by invisible brick. The dawn yet still, we rise. Through the smoke of cities and the storms of history, the human story moves forward. The peasant's fire becomes the forge of industry. Anne's voice becomes the echo of equality. Boston's defiance becomes the anthem of democracy. Caral's harmony becomes the blueprint of sustainability. Each age hands its lessons to the next. Each failure becomes foundation. Each triumph, a torch. Look at the world now, a mosaic of everything we have ever been. We carry their ashes in our lungs, their courage in our hearts. When we build skyscrapers, we are finishing the pyramids they began. When we share our stories, we are rekindling their fires beneath the same stars. The eternal return, perhaps, that is humanity's greatest secret, that even when we vanish, we are never truly gone. Caral may sleep beneath the sands, but its wisdom breathes in the engineers who build quake-proof cities today. Anne may rest beneath the stones of the tower, but her defiance lives in every voice that dares to question power. The peasants may have turned to dust, but their endurance lives in every family that survives hardship with laughter. The patriots of Boston may have faded into myth, but their fire burns in every nation that dreams of freedom. We are the sum of their courage, the continuation of their song, epilogue, the endurance of humanity. Night falls again, as it always has. The wind hums over fields and oceans, through ruins and skyscrapers alike. Somewhere, a single candle burns in a window, its flame trembling but unbroken. That is humanity, not the empires we build, nor the monuments we leave behind, but the quiet persistence of light in the dark. From the frozen huts of the Middle Ages, to the throne rooms of queens, to the harbours of revolution, to the deserts of forgotten worlds, we have endured, and we will endure still. Because though centuries may bury our names, they can never bury our purpose. We are the storytellers of the universe, the architects of memory, the children of endurance itself. As the sun rises once more over the ruins of Caral, over the green hills of England, over the harbours of America, and over every home where warmth is still a victory, the light touches all that we have been and all that we may yet become. This is humanity's story, not of kings or conquerors, but of survival, courage, and hope. A story still being written, one breath, one spark, one heart at a time.